Setting up, and then we're good. Hello and welcome everyone to this masterclass on the future of targeting in an increasingly privacy-first world. It's my pleasure to introduce Kasper Skub, the CEO and co-founder of Semasio. After starting his professional career in management consulting, he turned his focus towards online advertising technology. After spending some time with the semantic search engine startup Speed of Mind and at Wonderloop, a behavioral ad and content tech platform, he rejoined paths with a former colleague, and together they founded Semasio, the provider of targeting and insight solutions for programmatic advertising. He is joining us from the Semasio office in New York. With him on the digital stage, we have our very own Dr. Florian Heinemann. I don't think I need to spend too much time introducing him. He's one of the founding partners here at Project A. And with that, I will hand it off to our speakers.
Thanks a lot. So what we want to talk to you a little bit about, especially Kasper, but I have the honor to do a little bit of the introduction and give a little history lesson here, because I mean, as you've probably seen and heard and read about, there's a lot of discussion on how the future of targeting is going to look like. Is it going to be cookieless? What does Apple iOS 14 have to do with it? So a lot of discussion around this. And Kasper and I wanted to use the opportunity to show you a little bit of where we started off with targeting a few decades ago. What have been the great time in between? We call that the teens, and now where we are heading currently. But let's go back to the noughties. So that was the time of contextual targeting, and that was basically how targeting started. And essentially, that's the same way that targeting already worked in the offline world. And that is basically that the marketing message is geared to the context or to the actual content that a user is reading, because you use the actual fact that somebody's reading this context or reading this content as a proxy for what kind of user we're talking to. Yeah. So the idea is basically, and that's what we try to show on the slide, you assume, or the basic assumption is, if somebody's reading on used cars, or if somebody's reading about financial products, that person might be in the market to buy a financial product or buy a car. So that's basically the underlying assumption here. And that, if you think about it, has been the same kind of approach. If you look how print targeting has worked in the past, yeah, or targeting has worked also, how advertising has been sold in the past, you basically assumed that a certain readership or a certain viewership on average is interested in a certain piece of content or a certain topic, and that's why it makes sense to basically position some kind of advertising close to the content piece. And that could have been done in radio, that could have been done in print, or that also worked online. And that's basically how traditionally targeting worked. And then the big revolution came, basically led by cookies, and that's by the usage of cookies. And that was the so-called audience targeting. And that was kind of the time where performance marketing really took off. Why? Because here the idea was, you have a certain user with certain characteristics. In this case, our user is interested in luxury cars. He just quit smoking and he's very much into adventure travel. And if this user visits a certain website or a certain app, so that's what we try to illustrate here, the marketing message that user gets is irrespective, basically, or he gets regardless of what he actually consumes or what the person actually reads. But the marketing message is fully geared to the characteristics of that person that we identified earlier. And obviously what we have here kind of as an underlying assumption is that the user characteristics are fixed in a certain way, yeah, because we have certain data points where we know, okay, that person is into luxury cars, so we can advertise luxury cars to that user no matter what. So they're fixed in a certain way. And the other underlying assumption is basically that personal characteristics of a user beat kind of the context that this user is currently in. Yeah, so you disregarded kind of the context or the content that this user was reading in that very moment, or the user was interested in that very moment, because you basically had the assumption that we know that that person is interested in luxury cars or adventure travel, and that's why we have to show that person adventure travel ads, regardless of what that person is currently reading. And that has basically been the great time of performance marketing, and where you basically were optimizing campaigns solely on that. And a very prominent example of audience targeting has also been retargeting, where you basically identified users based on their past behavior vis-a-vis a certain shopping behavior, and showed that user the same product that that user had seen before. So it was kind of a static interest item for that user. And you showed that basically 5, 6, 7 times over the next few days, regardless of the context that that user was in. Yeah, so that was kind of the next evolution, and audience targeting worked a lot better for at least the performance-driven advertisers than the original version of the contextual targeting, because you were able to reduce in a certain way the dispersion loss that's always kind of going side by side if you use contextual targeting, because you always have to basically assume what the average reader looks like that is consuming a certain piece of content. And obviously averages are always wrong, and those were kind of things you could avoid by audience targeting. But obviously also that is not the best practice that you could go, and Casper is going to lead us into what very likely the future will look like of unified targeting.
Thank you, Florian, for this very concise history lesson. One of the things that happened as audience targeting started to become really prominent was that this user centricity started to rub certain very important stakeholder groups the wrong way. Very often, politicians and big technology companies and others in the industry like to speak for the consumers, saying that the consumers started to get creeped out, so to speak, by this development around very user-centric targeting, which led to, for instance, the creation of the GDPR legislation, harmonizing privacy legislation across the EU. That started, I wouldn't call it a revolution, but it definitely made some waves, made it over to the US in the form of, for instance, California's CCPA, and the LATAM countries started to look towards Europe to basically understand what best practice for privacy legislation would be. That also created sort of some movements with the big tech companies. Apple started cracking down on the third-party cookie, the main vehicle, as Flo said, for user-level targetability. In 2016, Firefox followed that lead. And then the really big percussive event was when the Chromium team, the team behind Google's Chrome browser, and actually also now Microsoft's Edge browser and others, announced that they would be going, following in the footsteps of Apple, and actually, by standard, denying third-party cookies' ability to basically track user behavior across multiple sites, to build these interests, to build these affinities, as Flo said, independently of the page where we actually show the ad. In other words, the profile was built using predominantly third-party cookies before the event of the user visiting this page. So there's a tremendous pressure building on this kind of user-level targetability, which means that as an industry, we now have the challenge of trying to find new ways, better ways to continue to target advertising. Because let's not forget, the targeting of advertising is what makes the attention that the user is giving to the page really valuable, which in the end finances the content. So it's not an insignificant function that the targeting of advertising is performing. Let's also not forget that as long as we're paying for content with our attention, we might as well be giving attention to relevant advertising rather than the quite annoying, if you ask me, irrelevant advertising that you often see if you don't have effective targeting. all of these movements, all of these different development trajectories have sort of started to gel a new paradigm, which I call unified targeting. It's just my neologism, so don't expect, like if you Google unified targeting, you'll find some answer, which is perfectly fine. Please do it. I'm just saying it's not an established term yet. It's in its infancy, but today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about a possible future for targeting that I see. And indeed, in a certain sense, with some of our partners, it's already here today. Again, we start with a user going to a specific page and consuming that page. Now, if you'll remember Flo's history lesson, for audience targeting, it's based on the user identifier. We somehow identify anonymously or not so anonymously in the States, as the case may be, the user, so that we can access the user's profile, so we can see that this user wants to quit smoking, so that we can put that marketing message into the page. So that's kind of audience targeting. But in unified targeting, you don't just base yourself off of the user. You may also base yourself off of the page URL. This is what Flo called contextual targeting. Well, not just Flo, like that is what we call contextual targeting. So now already we've got both potentially the user and the page. We may not have a user identifier. Why? Because actually the user might be on an iOS device on the Safari browser, in which case we won't have a user identifier. So then we can fall back, so to speak, to the page URL instead. So what we're starting to see here is kind of the dissolution of these traditional forms of targeting that Flo took us through to something where it's not super interesting to talk about either audience or contextual or technical or geographic targeting. It's just targeting. And the interesting thing is that for all of these attributes, for instance, just like the context you're reading, probably the device you're using to do it actually tells us a lot about you, where you live, or at least where you come, where you are physically as you're consuming this specific piece of content, can also be a very, very valuable attribute to try and understand who you are. And of course, time is very important. Also, when are you in the mood for this specific marketing message? This is not necessarily the same level of interest over the whole day and over every day of the week. You have a different susceptibility to different marketing messages at different days of week and different times of day, right? And so this is just a little sample of the attributes that we're starting to have access to in this kind of unified targeting world, where you're saying, look, if the user identifier is coming under so much pressure, we have to learn more tricks, right? Can you very reliably create a proxy for the user identifier for the actual user by a combination of, for instance, the page that this user is on, the page content, the device type, and the geolocation? It turns out you can, right? So what is happening is we are, as I said, sort of dissolving the boundaries between these different types of targeting that we used to look at as very, very specific disciplines, like either your audience targeting or your contextual targeting, your technical targeting, your geo-targeting, right? And just saying, no, it's all just flowing together into a new discipline, so to speak, or a meta-discipline, as it were, that we have chosen to call unified targeting. We shall see what label for it actually crystallizes as this starts to become a more established meta-discipline. And so this confluence, yes, we may have a user identifier. It could also in the future be one of Google's or Chrome's flocks. Flock keys, federated learning of cohorts, which denotes a group of many users, maybe thousands, maybe tens of thousands, maybe even in the low millions, right? That's another form of user identification. You're not identifying a single user, but a homogeneous group of users. That's a different form of user identification. Now, if you take that together with the page URL, can we start to say something intelligent and fairly precise about this user and this user's affinity And what does it give us if we add the device type? It's a very, very different proposition if you're using a cheap Android phone or the newest iPhone, right? That tells us a lot about the user behind this specific opportunity to put an ad in front of the user. And so the whole idea that the selection of the marketing message can be based off of this, let's call it portfolio of different attributes, each with its own significance, and each potentially present or not present, is what I think is so interesting and is sort of taking us into a new era where we're not talking about these individual disciplines. We're not dividing and conquering. Just I can't look at this in the unified way. Let me just focus on audience if I can, or let me just focus on contextual. It's saying when this user hits this page, we have an opportunity to influence that user. Let's take as many attributes we have about this opportunity to influence and make the best possible decision as to what marketing message we should be putting in front of this user on this device, on this URL, when he's in this specific geographic location, at this time of day, at this day of week. And I think that's a super interesting development, which sort of, you could almost getting philosophical for a second. It's like saying, look, light can be seen as a particle and a wave, but it's still light. What we're trying to get behind is saying, let's not talk about whether it's a particle or a wave. Let's not talk about audience targeting or contextual targeting. Instead, let's just talk about making the most intelligent decision as to what we should be doing with this opportunity to influence.
Caspar, could you talk a little bit about, which I think is a fascinating concept, how to make that actionable, right? I think the beauty of like Google and Facebook in the past was really, I could do audience targeting really easy
Yes.
because the setup was so, yeah, I mean, anybody with a credit card that had like a minimum of €5 on it and the ability to read was basically able to do that. How is a concept like that? I mean, I think it makes a lot of sense on the conceptual side, but how can you make that actionable? What kind of tools would you need to do that? And what kind of expertise do you need in-house?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really fair question. Let's also not forget that the walled gardens of Google, Facebook, Amazon, and so on are so powerful because they have very solid identity. And that identity is not only cross-device, it also substantially survives the assault, the attack that user-level targetability is coming under. So they will continue to be a very big player, very big part of the ecosystem. But we don't want to concentrate too much on them. We want to be able to operate in the open web. So one of the fascinating things that have been going on the past couple of years, especially as user-level targetability has come under so much pressure via the third-party cookie, is that targeting has started to swing from the buy side, from the demand side platforms, you could call it the high frequency trading platforms of online inventory, over to the supply side. You could call it more sort of the eBay or eBays of online inventory. They get more data on this opportunity to influence on this specific bid opportunity, such as these attributes. And so if you do your targeting on the SSP side, on the sell side, on the supply side, you have the option before you even send it over to the buying platform to already look at all these attributes in an integrated way and already have made a pre-decision and said, you know what, based on what I know about this bid opportunity, this user, even though I don't have a user identifier on him, has a very high affinity for wanting to quit smoking. And that way, the buy side has already been pre-informed that even though the user ID is missing, there is still a very high probability that this user belongs to the segment of users wanting to quit smoking right now. And so that is one of the things that's happening, this shift over to the sell side. Now, can you do this on the buy side as well? Of course you can, but the interesting shift is the shift to the sell side.
Actually, one question from the audience I think that we should take,
Yes.
That's basically related to the newest iPhone. Yeah, and like trying to explain a little bit. I mean, this question is more like, why do you think using the newest iPhone makes such a difference? From my perspective, this hype about queuing for the newest iPhone changed a bit in the last few years. And I think what's important to point out here, this is not about the hardware that's we're talking about here, but this is more about iOS 14. Can you discuss
15,
a little bit?
actually.
Oh, 15. Sorry. Can you discuss a little bit what iOS 15 is changing in terms of targeting and what that means? So it's not about the hardware anymore.
No. It's really about the operating system, because it's about what the operating system does on a very fundamental level, where we used to have so-called IDFAs, IDs for advertising, which are the identifiers available for in-app targeting. When I'm putting an ad inside an app, we had that unique identifier, which was consistent across many different apps that you use, and was also through probabilistic means connectable back to the user profile. So Flo, if your profile showed that you were trying to quit smoking via your browsing behavior on your MacBook, right? We could connect that to your IDFA. So when you opened an app, like your favorite app, whatever that might be, you could get targeted with quitting smoking banners, basically, right? What Apple has done is that they've continued their onerous focus on user privacy, being the champions for user privacy, by basically making apps ask you every time you open them whether it's okay for this app to actually use your ID for advertising across multiple sessions, apps, whatever it might be. And the numbers we're seeing is that very, very few users are actually allowing it. In fact, I'm in the industry, I'm actually kind of hypocritical when I see it. I'm like, why should Uber have the right to track me across different apps? Like, what's in it for me? And I say no, right? And that has had a massive impact, because there's very high iPhone proliferation, and in a certain sense, Apple is now doing to the iPhone in app what they already did with their Safari browser 5 years ago, with this decision to deny third-party cookies as standard, which is our way of tracking across multiple different sites to build our URLs, to build our profiles.
And I think what's important to point that out, and unfortunately we're at the end of our time, but I think what's really important to point that out is that is kind of one of the key elements, or one of the key arguments why something like the concept of unified targeting will become more and more relevant, because the moment that Apple, or also, as we said, like the Chrome browser, etc., pushes back the identification that's needed to do audience targeting in a proper way, that's when you basically need to engage new concepts. Yeah. So, and that's basically the message we want to get across. So if you are interested in this concept, check out what Semasio has to offer here in terms of knowledge, and there's a couple of really good content pieces also on your website to explain this, how you can actually work with this, and what the relevance of first-party data is in that context as well. So I think that's also a great element here. Thanks a lot for sharing this with us, Caspar. Yeah.
And thank you for the history lesson, Flo. Very instructive.
Great, thank you to Caspar and to Flo for this insightful session, and thanks everyone who listened in. I hope you have a great rest